Bullies grabbed her shirt and shouted. She shoved him into a locker. Kira Thorne adjusted her oversized hoodie for the 100th time that morning, pulling it down to cover as much of her small frame as possible. At barely 5 feet tall, with wild curly hair that refused to be tamed and thick-rimmed glasses that seemed to engulf half her face, she had learned early on that invisibility was her best defense at Roosevelt High School. The sprawling brick building with its maze of hallways and endless stream of students had become her prison for the past 3 months since her family moved from Oregon. She clutched her worn backpack straps tighter as she navigated through the crowded hallway, dodging groups of students who barely acknowledged her existence. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors where her sneakers squeaked softly with each careful step. Her destination was always the same, the library, where she could disappear among the stacks of books and pretend the outside world didn't exist. Well, what do we have here?" The voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade. Kira's stomach dropped as she recognized the sneering tone of Blake Morrison, the self-appointed king of Roosevelt High. Standing at over 6 feet with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident swagger that came from never being told no, Blake commanded attention wherever he went. His Letterman jacket stretched across broad shoulders, and his green eyes held a cruel glint that made Kira's skin crawl. Flanking him were his loyal followers, Trevor Walsh, a stocky redhead with freckles and a permanent scowl, and Danny Russo, whose dark hair was always slicked back and whose laugh sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Together, they formed an intimidating triangle that blocked Kira's path to the library. "Look, guys, it's the little mouse," Blake continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Still trying to hide in that tent you call a sweatshirt?" Kira's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to sidestep around them, but Trevor moved to block her path. Students began to slow down, sensing drama, but none dared to intervene. This was Blake's domain, and everyone knew better than to challenge him. "I'm just trying to get to class," Kira mumbled, her voice barely audible above the hallway noise. "What was that?" Blake cupped his ear theatrically. "I can't hear you over all that mumbling. Maybe if you didn't dress like a homeless person, people might actually want to listen to what you have to say." Danny snickered, and Trevor cracked his knuckles. The sound made Kira flinch, a reaction that only seemed to encourage them further. What they didn't know, what nobody at Roosevelt High knew, was that Kira had been studying Krav Maga since she was 8 years old. Her father, a former military contractor, had insisted she learn to defend herself after a break-in at their old house. For years, she had trained 3 times a week, learning to turn an attacker's strength against them, to strike with precision and devastating effect. But she couldn't use those skills. Not here, not against fellow students. Her father had drilled into her that martial arts were for life or death situations, not schoolyard conflicts. "Violence should always be the last resort," he had told her countless times. "Walk away when you can, fight only when you must." So she endured. Day after day, week after week, she swallowed her pride and her training, telling herself it would get better, that they would get bored and move on to someone else. She was wrong. The incidents escalated slowly at first. Blake would accidentally knock her books from her hands in the hallway, sending papers scattering across the floor while students stepped over them without a second glance. Trevor would bump into her hard enough to send her stumbling into lockers, the metal clanging, echoing through the corridor. Danny would make loud comments about her appearance whenever she passed, each word carefully chosen to maximize humiliation. The cafeteria became a minefield. Kira learned to time her entrance carefully, waiting until Blake and his crew were already seated before making her move. She would grab a sandwich and find an empty table in the corner, hoping to eat in peace, but peace was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Hey, mouse!" Blake's voice boomed across the cafeteria during lunch on a particularly cruel Tuesday. "Why don't you come sit with us? We promise not to bite." The entire cafeteria turned to look as Kira froze, her turkey sandwich halfway to her mouth. Heat flooded her cheeks as dozens of eyes focused on her, waiting to see what would happen next. She could feel her hands trembling as she set down her food. "I'm fine here, thanks," she managed to say, her voice stronger than she felt. "Oh, but I insist." Blake stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Trevor, Danny, why don't you go escort our friend over here?" The two boys rose like trained attack dogs, their grins predatory. Kira's muscles tensed, her body automatically shifting into a defensive stance before she caught herself. She forced her shoulders to relax, her hands to unclench. She couldn't fight, not here, not now. As Trevor and Danny approached, she grabbed her backpack and hurried toward the exit, leaving her uneaten lunch behind. The sound of their laughter followed her out of the cafeteria, echoing in her ears long after she'd escaped to the safety of an empty classroom. Mrs. Patterson, her English teacher, looked up from her desk with concern. "Kira, is everything all right, dear?" "I'm fine," Kira lied, settling into a desk near the window. "Just wanted to get some reading done before class." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment, her kind eyes seeing more than Kira wanted to reveal, but she simply nodded and returned to her work. It was the same response Kira received from all the teachers. They saw what was happening, but nobody wanted to get involved. It was easier to look the other way, to pretend that teenage cruelty was just a normal part of growing up. The gymnasium was another battleground. During mandatory physical education, Blake would accidentally throw balls at her head during dodgeball, the rubber spheres connecting with sickening thuds that left her ears ringing. Coach Martinez would blow his whistle and call it an accident, but the smirk on Blake's face told a different story. "Sorry, Mouse," he would say with false sincerity. "Guess you need to work on those reflexes." If only he knew about her reflexes. If only he knew that she could have caught that ball and thrown it back hard enough to knock him flat on his back. But she gritted her teeth and rubbed her bruised shoulder, saving her rage for her punching bag at home. The locker room was the worst. Away from the watchful eyes of teachers, Blake and his friends felt free to escalate their torment. They would hide her clothes while she showered, forcing her to search frantically while wrapped in a towel. They would slam locker doors near her head, the metallic crashes making her jump. Once, they filled her backpack with shaving cream, ruining her textbooks and homework. Through it all, Kira remained silent. She cleaned up the messes, replaced her belongings, and tried to convince herself that ignoring them would make them lose interest. But bullies feed on reactions, and her obvious distress only made them hungry for more. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in mid-November. Kira was walking to her locker after biology class, her mind focused on the weekend ahead and the blessed 2-day reprieve from Blake's torment. She was thinking about the new Krav Maga techniques her instructor had shown her the night before, complex combinations that required split-second timing and perfect form. She didn't notice Blake and his friends waiting by her locker until it was too late. "There she is," Blake announced loudly, drawing the attention of nearby students. "The invisible girl herself." Kira approached cautiously, her key ready to quickly open her locker and grab her things. But as she reached for the combination lock, Trevor's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "Not so fast, Mouse," he sneered. "We want to talk to you." "Let go of me," Kira said, trying to pull her arm free, but Trevor's grip was strong, his fingers digging into her skin. "You know what I think?" Blake stepped closer, his presence looming over her. "I think you're hiding something. Nobody's that much of a loser without a reason." "Maybe she's got scars under that hoodie," Danny suggested with a cruel laugh. "Maybe that's why she covers up all the time." Blake's eyes lit up with malicious interest. "Is that it, Mouse? Are you hiding something under there?" Before Kira could react, Blake's hand shot out and grabbed the front of her hoodie. The fabric stretched and pulled as he yanked at it, trying to lift it up. Kira's hands flew to her shirt, trying to hold it down, but Blake was stronger and more determined. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking with panic and rage. "Leave me alone!" But Blake didn't stop. If anything, her distress seemed to fuel him. He pulled harder, the fabric straining against his grip. Students began to gather, forming a circle around the confrontation. Some pulled out their phones, ready to record whatever happened next. "Come on, Mouse," Blake taunted, his fingers twisted in her hoodie. "What are you so afraid of showing us?" That's when Kira saw her. Emma Rodriguez stood at the edge of the crowd, her dark eyes wide with concern. Emma was everything Kira wasn't. Confident, popular, beautiful. Her long black hair fell in perfect waves around her shoulders, and her smile could light up a room. They had been lab partners in chemistry for the past month, and Emma had always been kind to her, treating her like a real person instead of an annoyance to be ignored. "Blake, stop," Emma said, pushing through the crowd. "Leave her alone." Blake's grip on Kira's hoodie loosened slightly as he turned to face Emma. Well, if it isn't the do-gooder, this doesn't concern you, Emma." "It concerns me when you're attacking someone who can't defend themselves," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Blake's expression darkened. "You know what, Emma? Maybe you need to learn the same lesson as your little friend here." He released Kira's hoodie and moved toward Emma, his intentions clear. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emma stood her ground, but Kira could see the fear in her eyes. And that's when something inside Kira snapped. Years of training, months of humiliation, and a lifetime of being told to walk away suddenly meant nothing. Blake had crossed a line by threatening Emma, and Kira wasn't going to let him hurt the only person who had shown her kindness. "Get away from her," Kira said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Blake pause. He turned back to her with a laugh. "Oh, look, the mouse found her voice. What are you going to do about it, freak?" Blake lunged at Kira, his hand reaching for her hoodie again. But this time, she was ready. Everything slowed down as her training kicked in. She could see the trajectory of his movement, the openings in his defense, the perfect moment to strike. Her hand shot up and caught his wrist, her fingers finding the pressure point her instructor had taught her. Blake's eyes widened in surprise and pain as his grip went limp. Before he could react, Kira pivoted on her heel and used his own momentum against him, sending him stumbling backward. "What the hell?" Blake started to say, but Kira wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her small frame suddenly radiating confidence and power. "I said get away from her!" Trevor and Danny moved to flank her, but Kira was already calculating angles and distances. When Trevor swung at her, she ducked under his arm and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the ground. Danny hesitated for a moment, clearly reconsidering his life choices, but Blake's angry shout spurred him into action. Danny charged at her like a bull, all muscle and no technique. Kira sidestepped at the last second and grabbed his outstretched arm, using his weight and momentum to flip him over her shoulder. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. The crowd gasped, phones recording every moment. Blake stared at his fallen friends in disbelief before turning back to Kira with rage in his eyes. "You little freak," he snarled, pulling back his fist. "I'm going to destroy you." Blake's punch came fast and hard, but Kira had been expecting it. She leaned back, letting his fist whistle past her face, then grabbed his extended arm and twisted. Blake cried out in pain as Kira applied pressure to his elbow joint, forcing him to his knees. "You want to know what I'm hiding?" Kira said, her voice calm and controlled despite the chaos around them. "I'm hiding the fact that I could have ended this months ago. I'm hiding the fact that I've been trained to hurt people, and I chose not to use that training because I thought you might eventually grow up." She applied more pressure, and Blake gasped in pain. "But you just made a mistake. You threatened someone I care about, and now I'm done playing nice." Blake tried to break free, but Kira's grip was iron. She had him completely at her mercy, and everyone in the hallway could see it. The great Blake Morrison, terror of Roosevelt High, was on his knees and helpless. "Please," Blake whimpered, his cocky facade cracking. "Please, I'm sorry. I'll leave you alone." For a moment, Kira felt the temptation to hurt him, to make him pay for every humiliation, every moment of fear, every tear she had shed because of his cruelty. She could feel the power flowing through her, the knowledge that she could break his arm with a simple twist of her wrist. But she didn't. Instead, she looked down at him with something that might have been pity. "I'm not going to become like you," she said quietly. "But if you ever touch me or Emma again, if you ever hurt someone who can't defend themselves, I won't be so merciful next time." She released him, and Blake scrambled backward, clutching his arm. Trevor and Danny were already pulling themselves to their feet, their faces flushed with embarrassment and pain. "Are you okay?" Emma appeared at Kira's side, her eyes shining with admiration and concern. "I'm fine," Kira said, suddenly aware of all the eyes on her. The hallway was silent except for the sound of Blake and his friends retreating, their reputations in ruins. "That was incredible," Emma whispered. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My dad taught me," Kira replied, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. "He said I should only use it to protect myself or someone I care about." Emma's smile was radiant. "Someone you care about?" Kira felt her cheeks burn, but she nodded. "Yeah, someone I care about." The crowd began to disperse, students whispering excitedly about what they had witnessed. The story would spread through the school like wildfire, but for once, Kira didn't mind being the center of attention. In the days that followed, Roosevelt High felt like a different place. Blake and his friends gave Kira a wide berth, their eyes dropping to the floor whenever they passed her in the hallway. The casual cruelty that had once been their trademark was replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations. Other students began to approach Kira with newfound respect. Some wanted to know about her training, others simply wanted to be associated with the girl who had taken down Blake Morrison. She found herself invited to sit at different lunch tables, included in conversations she had never been part of before. But the most meaningful change was her relationship with Emma. What had started as lab partner chemistry had blossomed into something deeper. They spent their lunch breaks together, talking about everything from their favorite movies to their dreams for the future. Emma had a way of making Kira feel seen and valued, not just for her fighting skills, but for who she was as a person. "I always thought you were interesting," Emma admitted one afternoon as they sat in the courtyard, sharing a bag of chips. "But I didn't know how to approach you. You seemed so guarded." "I was protecting myself," Kira said, watching a group of younger students play frisbee on the grass. "I've been the new kid enough times to know that standing out usually means getting hurt. But you stood out anyway," Emma pointed out, "just not in the way you expected." Kira smiled, thinking about how much her life had changed in such a short time. "My dad always said that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when you don't want to." 2 weeks after the confrontation, Kira was surprised to find Blake waiting by her locker after school. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped and his usual swagger replaced by nervous energy. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. Kira studied him for a moment, her hand instinctively moving to her backpack strap. "What do you want, Blake?" "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "What I did to you, what we did, it was wrong. I know that now." "You know that now?" Kira repeated, her voice skeptical. "You didn't know it was wrong when you were doing it." Blake's face flushed. I don't know what I thought. I guess I liked feeling powerful, and you were an easy target. But seeing you fight back, seeing how strong you really are, it made me realize how pathetic I was being." "Apologizing doesn't undo months of torment," Kira said firmly. "It doesn't erase the fear or the humiliation." "I know," Blake nodded. "I can't take back what I did, but I can promise it won't happen again, to you or anyone else." Kira considered his words, seeing something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Genuine remorse. Actions speak louder than words, Blake. If you really want to make amends, prove it by being better. I will, he said earnestly. I promise. As Blake walked away, Kira felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The confrontation had changed more than just her status at school. It had changed her understanding of herself. She had learned that strength wasn't just about physical ability or fighting skills. It was about knowing when to fight and when to show mercy, when to stand up and when to step back. Emma appeared at her side, having watched the exchange from a distance. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Free," Kira replied, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. "For the first time in months, I feel free." They walked out of the school together, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Kira no longer felt the need to hide in oversized hoodies or avoid eye contact with her classmates. She had found her voice, her strength, and something even more valuable. She had found someone who saw her for who she really was. The girl who had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore, not because she sought attention, but because she had learned to stand tall and face the world with confidence. Roosevelt High would never be the same, and neither would she. As they reached the street, Emma slipped her hand into Kira's, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Want to grab some coffee? I know this great place downtown." Kira smiled, feeling the warmth of Emma's touch and the promise of whatever came next. "I'd like that." The story of the quiet girl who fought back would become legend at Roosevelt High, passed down through generations of students who heard whispers in the hallways about the day everything changed. But for Kira, it wasn't about becoming a legend. It was about finding the courage to be herself, to protect what mattered, and to never let anyone make her feel small again. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from choosing mercy when you have the power to do harm. In sparing Blake when she could have hurt him, she had proven that strength and compassion could coexist, that standing up for yourself didn't require losing your humanity. The bullies had grabbed her shirt and shouted, expecting her to cower as she always had. Instead, she had shoved back against their cruelty and found something infinitely more valuable than revenge. She had found herself.